Hey, welcome to 12 Tones. Sometimes when researching, I stumble onto these fascinating musical anecdotes, little stories that provide a window into a completely different musical world, and today I want to tell you one of those stories. I also want to issue a challenge, actually two challenges, but we'll get to the second one at the end. First, I want to tell you about a little musical puzzle from the late 1800s that went on to have a surprising impact on the music of the time, and even pops up occasionally today. This is the story of La Scala Enigmatica, or the enigmatic scale. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Our story begins in 1888 in Milan, Italy. This was well into the Romantic period, and widespread interest in concert music led to a thriving industry of music-based journals to keep people up to date on the musical happenings of the day. One such journal, the Gazzetta Musicale di Milano, published weekly by Casa Ricordi, featured news about musical concerts, especially opera, as well as a bunch of short articles that might be of interest to local musicians. A regular feature of the Gazzetta was the Rebus section, which featured a little puzzle or game related to music. For example, in the edition published August 12, 1888, the rebus was this, to which the answer is obviously Re dell'abisso affrettati, an aria from Un ballo in maschera by Giuseppe Verdi. Remember that composer, he's gonna come up again later. The scale we're talking about didn't actually appear in the rebus section, but I mention it because I think it demonstrates an important point. To a certain extent, for the readers of the Gazzetta and other journals like it, music was a game. It wasn't just something very serious people did for very serious art reasons, it was also a fun thing to think about and play around with. Understanding that context is vital in understanding what happened next. The actual story, though, begins with an article in the August 5th edition titled Curiosità Armoniche, or Harmonic Curiosities, and no, I don't know why those ellipses are there, but they were. The article was short, just a couple sentences and a bit of notation. It read, "From Bologna we've been sent the following scale, that, when harmonized properly, says its inventor, will prove effective. Leave the undertaking of the task to those musicians who enjoy the study of harmony," and underneath it was this. I want to draw specific attention to the word effective here because again, it highlights that the goal wasn't to make a beautiful symphony or anything. The scale was intentionally hard to use and unlikely to yield the next great masterpiece, at least by the standards of the time, but the challenge of trying to make it work might still prove rewarding, and the inventor assures us that if you're clever, you can find a harmonization that's good enough. But in order to understand why this was an interesting challenge, we have to put ourselves in the mindset of a 19th century Italian composer. Let's start with a bit of translation. The Gazzetta called this a scale, but they didn't mean that in the way you or I would normally use that word today. When we talk about scales, we're referring to the set of notes a piece of music uses, as well as some information about how those notes are used. Like if a song uses mostly these notes and treats this one like it's the root, then it's probably using the D major scale. But that's not what the Gazzetta meant. You were allowed to use any notes you wanted here, and they expected their readers to know that. No, a more accurate analogy would be that what they presented was a bass line. These were the notes your chords were supposed to be built on. But you couldn't just use any chords. For it to be a puzzle, there had to be rules, and those rules came not from the Gazzetta, but from the musical vocabulary of the day. Readers would have understood that they were supposed to employ traditional functional harmony, using certain chords in certain positions because that was the behavior those chords were assumed to have. For example, besides the one chord, the most important chord in any key from a functional perspective is the 5 chord, but if we look through this scale, we see there is no 5. Each 8-bar phrase starts and ends on C, so it seems very likely we're in that key, but if so, then we have no way of writing a root position G chord. Fortunately, the harmonic vocabulary of the time does give us another option, inversions. This is where the lowest note in the chord isn't the root. It's not that common these days, but inversions were all over the place in the Romantic period, so again, readers would have been perfectly happy to use them. There's still not a lot of room for 5 chords, but we can fit one in bar 7 over the B, and if we're desperate enough, we can even squeeze one into bar 15 with a D flat too. This forces us to use a slightly wonky version of the 5 chord, voiced with a tritone in the bass, but it's allowed, and that's good enough. The next thing to wrestle with is the structure. It walks all the way up the scale, then all the way back down, and because classical harmony is so directional, you can't just reuse the same set of chords going backwards. You have to find 2 different ways of harmonizing each of these notes, and most of them are not that easy to harmonize. Broadly speaking, a good rule of thumb is that notes from outside the key want to resolve by half step, but many of them don't really get to. Like this D flat does at the end, but at the beginning it jumps up an augmented second to E instead. Likewise, the F sharp going up implies a resolution to G, but we already saw we have no G, so instead it goes a whole step to G sharp, which is itself an out of key note and also moves by whole step to A sharp. This all creates a really strong pull to resolve by half step to B, but that's also weird because B is the leading tone of the key, which means it's supposed to be the one doing the resolve. solving. A strong resolution here would make the following C sound weak even though it's the actual root. And going down, the scale even changes slightly, replacing the F sharp with an F natural. This puts it back in the key, but since it's preceded by G sharp, we wind up with another weird augmented second leap to contend with instead. It's really hard to orient yourself, and even when a note works well in one direction, it often falls apart in the other. The structure also presents another problem, this one related not to the chords but to the writing process itself. The Gazetta's readers would have assumed they were supposed to realize this piece in 4-part writing, a style where 4 independent melodic lines, traditionally called soprano, alto, tenor, and bass even if they weren't meant to be sung, combined to form a harmonic progression. The interaction between these voices was governed by a set of rules called Counterpoint, and while I won't get into every way in which traditional counterpoint made this harder, there's one big one we really need to address. Basically, when writing counterpoint, you want to avoid parallelism. This is where 2 voices move the same interval in the same direction at the same time, and it makes them blend together so they become less like independent melodic lines and more like one unified melody. This isn't a big deal if the voices are a less consonant interval, like say a third apart, but that blending effect, combined with the harmonic strength of a really consonant interval like a fifth or octave, can make you almost completely lose one of the lines, so you're not allowed to do it. I want to stress that this isn't like a rule of music or anything, but it is a rule of 19th century counterpoint, and it's a rule the Gazetta's readers would have been following. In order to avoid parallelism, one of the best rules of thumb in 4-part writing is that if your bass moves by step, all your other voices should probably move the opposite direction. Depending on inversions, this may not be strictly necessary, but it's pretty helpful. But what if your bass keeps moving up by step over and over for an entire octave? Well, then all your other voices are supposed to keep moving down to match it, which winds up squeezing you pretty tightly by the end. Because these lines are usually treated as vocal lines, they have a specific range they're supposed to stay in, so you can't start your soprano too high, but if you start it too low, you'll wind up crossing your voices, moving some of your higher lines below the ones that are supposed to be lower. You might even force your tenor below your bass, which would change the inversion. That's also not allowed, so you had to be really careful with your voice leading. Harmonically speaking, the scale also presents another challenge because different sections seem to be drawn from different scales. The first bit feels reminiscent of harmonic minor, one of the few scales in common use at the time that featured an augmented second. Specifically, this feels like what you get if you started on the 5th note of the harmonic minor scale and walked up from there, implying that maybe we're actually starting on the 5 chord, except instead of resolving that to the implied 1, we get this bit, which looks like the whole tone scale, a scale where all the notes are separated by whole step. The whole tone scale had seen some use at the time, often to depict the ominous or mysterious, but it would still have been a fairly unusual sight for most musicians. And at the end of the scale we get this, where it switches from whole steps to half steps, evoking the chromatic scale and forcing us to contend with bizarre half-step motion to close out our scale. With all that in mind, how could we possibly approach this mysterious scale? Well, we can find a couple answers in the Gazetta's August 26th issue, where they published some reader submissions for what they were now calling the Scala Rebus, and they also revealed its inventor, Adolfo Crescentini. Crescentini was a professor of music at the Bologna Conservatory, but beyond that I can't really find much of anything about him. None of his works are on the Internet Music Score Library project, nor do there seem to be any recordings on YouTube. His biggest contribution to music seems to have been this one scale. So how did he solve the puzzle? Like this. Which, yeah, I'd say effective is roughly how I'd describe that. It follows the rules and there's some neat compositional flourishes, especially in the soprano line, but it's hardly exciting. In Crescentini's defense though, he was bound by an additional constraint that many of the other submissions didn't follow. His whole piece was written in first species counterpoint. The species system is basically a way of describing how rhythmically complex the lines are, and first species means it's all 1 against 1. That is, all the lines move at the same time. Each of the upper voices has exactly 1 note for each note the bass plays. This makes that whole voice leading problem much more difficult. Notice how in bar 8, Crescentini's bass and soprano are only a major third apart, and the extra harmonic rigidity of the first species motion limits the choices for chords and chord functions too. All but one of the other published submissions use 2 or more notes per bass note at least sometimes. This gave them an easy out to the voice leading problem. When the bass moves up, everything else moves down, but if you then change chords again, you can move everything back up while the bass sits still. I'm not going to run through all the submitted solutions because that'd take a long time, but I'll put a link in the description to a paper by Dr. Richard Burke, which features recordings of many of them. I'm particularly fond of Aldo Forli's, it's got a really nice shape to it. The Gazzetta also claimed to have received many more submissions that they didn't publish because they altered the scale in some small way. I'm guessing some people didn't notice the F was different on the descending line, but who knows what other changes people made to try to make sense of all this. And that might have been it. The Gazzetta published one more solution in their October 7th issue, but the whole thing had run its course and the music world moved on to new things. Except, remember Giuseppe Verdi? Yeah, he visited Milan in 1889, a couple months after the Scala Rebus this trend had passed, and it seems like his friend Arrigo Boito showed it to him as an idle curiosity. Verdi experimented with it while he was there, and he seems to have continued thinking about the scale after returning home, because he wrote Boito a letter reading, "As I was leaving Milan, I threw some papers into the fireplace, among them also that awkward scale. If you have not burned it, send me the chords of the A sharp and G sharp." Basically, he'd harmonized it, but he didn't remember exactly how. But his ambitions were more than just completing Crescentini's puzzle. No, Verdi wanted to turn the Scala Rebus, or as he would later call it, the Scala Enigmatica, into a real piece. He thought he could use it to set the famous Ave Maria prayer, and after years of work and some mixed results, he finally came up with a version he was happy with. Since Ave Maria is traditionally broken up into two halves, he decided to repeat the prayer twice. This gave him 4 halves to work with, and since there are 4 main choral voice types, he decided he would let each one sing the scale up and down in one of the halves. Boito was skeptical that the scale could work outside the bass, but Verdi made it happen, and the end results are pretty cool. That same paper by Dr. Burke also contains an excerpt from the 3rd section where the tenor takes the scale, and it sounds pretty great. But Verdi didn't want the piece published because, in his words, it's not true music, it's a tour de force, it's a game. He'd done it to see if he could, not to express some divine musical inspiration or whatever. Still, despite his wishes, it was eventually published as part of his Quattro Pezzi Sacri, a collection of 4 pieces of church music he composed near the end of his life. And finally, we come to the modern day, where the Scala Enigmatica, or in English the enigmatic scale, is largely a historical curiosity, but some modern musicians have decided to play around with it, including rock guitarist Joe Satriani in The Enigmatic and the jazz fusion band Yellow Jackets in their song Enigma. So here's my first challenge to you: write some music with the enigmatic scale. You can use the original bassline structure and try to do 4-part writing, or you can use it like a modern scale and just write some cool riffs with it. Either way's fine, and if you come up with something you like, send it to me on Twitter and I'll put together a master thread. But as for my second challenge, I feel like composition puzzles should be a thing again. It's a really cool idea and I'd love to make some, but I honestly don't know how to do it. Modern music just doesn't have enough rules. Crescentini's puzzle relied on a lot of assumptions about how music is supposed to work, but those assumptions just don't really hold anymore, and with so many different genres and artists these days, there isn't really a new set to replace them. Like, I could make a 4-chord loop and ask you to write a melody over it, but what are the odds I can come up with a loop that's weirder than what's already out there? My random scale challenges were the closest I've come, but they were just so open-ended that it's hard to think of them as a puzzle. Still, I want this to be a thing, so if you have any idea how to make it one, send me an email and I may feature some of my favorites in a future video. And if you've spent this long listening to me talk about music, you might be interested to know that I have a podcast now. It's called Ghost Notes, it's with Noah from the YouTube channel Polyphonic, and the first episode is up now on Nebula. We talk about finding new music, how listening to music changes when it's your job, and we also go off on like a bunch of music-related tangents. It was a blast to make, and I'm really excited to share it with the world. It's a Nebula original project, so all the episodes will be going up early and ad-free over there. In case you don't know, Nebula is a streaming service built by some of YouTube's top educational creators, including Adam Neely, Mia Mulder, and Real Engineering, plus me, Noah, and a bunch of others. We initially launched it as a video site, but we finally expanded to podcasts, so if you're interested in those, there's a bunch of cool new projects that just went up. If you want to check those out, or if you want to hear all the new Ghost Notes episodes as they're released, we've even worked out a deal where if you sign up for CuriosityStream with the link in the description, not only do you get 26% off their annual plan, you'll also get a Nebula account free for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. That's 2 sites worth of great educational content for under $15 a year. It's an amazing deal. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Susan Jones and Jill Sundgaard. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.